Good morning. My name is Tarek Tihan, and I will be making this presentation on behalf of Professor Nazan Janblot and myself. We gave this presentation about a year ago at our Koç University School of Medicine educational retreat, and we were also invited by College Office of Learning Technology to represent this lecture to you. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be presenting this on behalf of Office of Learning Technology, which has been critical and instrumental in our endeavors, educational endeavors at Koç University School of Medicine. And we are grateful both for their leadership and everyday activities that we work with Office of Learning Technology. So without further ado, I would like to present a brief journey into our educational theories. Our learning objectives in this presentation is number one, to give you our perspective of education and teaching as concepts, and then also define educational theory and review at least some of the very prominent educational theories and their key tenets. This will hopefully help everyone understand how educational theories can actually influence our everyday teaching and how it makes us understand why certain practices or certain methodologies were developed in a particular way, and what is a more appropriate way of using them, knowing the theory or knowing how it really should work. So there are many definitions that somewhat are transparent. In everyday life, we do use a lot of terms, but we usually do not think or stop and think of their actual meaning. And education is one of those transparent words. What really constitutes education? When do you think you actually have engaged in education? Because every day we do, especially in medical school, is a huge transfer of knowledge, whether it's from patients to clinicians, whether from clinicians to medical students, to students to residents and the staff, etc. So I think there are a few points that I would like to emphasize in this whole concept. So if education is a system in essence, and it is about learning skills and knowledge. So a system that teaches you how to acquire new skills and knowledge. It also develops personality and attitude, and this actually will become more obvious when we talk about more recent theories in education, which social and individual attributes of a particular society are considered. Again, we also aim to develop, physically and emotionally within these systems that education aims to develop us, mature us, in other words. And the goal of that maturation is the better ability to cope, understand, and maybe utilize nature. Doesn't always go that way, obviously. And in recent years, it is becoming clearer and clearer that education is a very social cultural activity. And I will talk about this, I will elaborate what this really means a little bit later. And it is a transfer of human experience. I think with many issues, our collective consciousness, collective knowledge is an accumulation that can only be developed when there is transfer of human experience from one generation, from one individual to another, or one generation to the next. And finally, education very often, especially adult education, doesn't really happen on a blank slate. I think prior ideas, feelings, experiences significantly influences learning, predominantly in adult education. But I also submit that kind of idea, feelings, and emotions, or response to the social environment also influences children's learning, or learning of humans at any age. But teaching, on the other hand, is the act of the system, is almost like the product of the system. And teaching, the action of this product, leads to cognitive gain in a particular individual. And this has become much more obvious in some of the theories that have come in the 20th century. And environment, especially with the sociocultural theories, this becomes more and more prominent, that environment really influences teaching as well as learning. So where you do your training, how you create the environment or how you modify the environment of learning or teaching becomes really crucial as to how effective you are and how successful you are. The cognitive aspect of learning, especially when we talk about some of the more recent theories, the so-called cognitive load theory, for instance, really pays a lot of attention to this load that you can have in a given particular time at a given particular instance. And that load will actually have to induce recall, which is fundamental to teaching. So there are really almost three fundamental elements to think about when you're talking about how someone learns. And then there's register, retention, and recall. And inducing recall through all of this is the main function of how should one teach. And teaching, again, is changing behavior and attitude. This is, again, for more recent theories in education, that it is not just acquisition of knowledge or repetition of behavior. It is actually changing one's behavior and attitude towards life or towards nature. Teaching should have to be much more parsimonious about how an individual learns, because we know that there are as many learning styles as different characters. And that's really very important to recognize in the practice of teaching, should actually consider that not everyone learns in the same fashion. And then finally, especially with the experiential theories in recent years, it is clear that teaching allows people to do or live new experiences. And that should be the ultimate goal of teaching activities. So what is an educational theory? So you could obviously recognize that there may be a lot more, and one can find many more attributes to the concepts of education as well as learning. So the concepts or the comprehensive definition of both these terms are difficult to reach. So how about educational theory? If that's a challenge, how do you kind of define what an educational theory is? And there are different opinions. So there are many ideas or individuals who have come up with systems which are considered educational theories, and then they're just as valid or effective models or methods or systems others have come up, which most people do not consider as an educational theory. So an educational theory can be a moving target based on what literature you're reading. But as far as we're concerned, educational theory is basically a study area that seeks to understand how people learn, how people apply their learning, and how people improve their efficacy of their learning programs. So if you actually have a set of ideas by someone that addresses these three fundamental functions or the fundamental aspects of education process, I think that constitutes an educational theory. And we'll see that in some of the examples as well. So why are really educational theories important? This is probably saying the last thing first, and we will probably repeat this at the end because it really deserves being repeated a number of times. Understanding how a mechanism works, understanding the mechanisms of teaching practices are really key to understanding how effective you can be or how you can improve your teaching. So learning theories allow teachers to understand how their students learn and how to use these different methods. And through using these different methods, one can develop a more comprehensive learning strategy and help his or her students in acquiring new experiences and acquiring new skills and behavior through this process. Well, all teachers approach training in a way that's governed by one or more educational theories. Even if you don't know you're applying a particular theory, when you see a method being applied by one of your colleagues and you like it and you take it and you apply it, you're essentially using the product of a particular theory. This is almost similar to driving a car. I mean, you don't have to know how a car functions in order to be able to get on the driver's seat and drive a car. But there's actually a mechanism how that car works. And that's the educational theory. And sometimes if you want to use that car more efficiently, if you want to be able to repair that car, improve that car, then you will have to find out how that works. And that's the educational theory. And interestingly, the evolution of learning theories, the evolution of educational theories, and in this context, learning theories and educational theories are being used interchangeably, parallels the evolution of societies and everything that ultimately influences our lives. So as we become a more egalitarian society, as we become more democratic, you find out that the educational theories follow suit. So everything that we do in education is reflected in the society. So what are prominent educational theories? There is a whole plethora, maybe hundreds of theories, or what people consider theories in education. So it's not easily summarizable in a list. But there are a few examples that constitute the fundamental milestones in our understanding and in our expansion of knowledge. And those milestones are essentially changing in the fundamental approaches to cognitive science, as well as education, and as well as transfer of knowledge. So we'll talk about these few examples, but suffice it to say that the list that we will provide you in terms of educational theories can be expanded by a magnitude. And there are many things I probably will not be touching upon which you find important or which are really important in other circumstances. But this is what we chose in terms of being able to express issues that are somewhat practical and somewhat relevant to our everyday teaching practice. So here's a brief list of individuals and theories that we'd like to cover. Now, none of these individuals are the sole definers or sole descriptives of these theories. They are actually the prominent individuals that are often identified with this particular theory or identified with this particular educational model, but there are many, many individuals and scientists who've actually contributed to the formation of these concepts like nativistic or behavioristic theories, etc. But we'd like to focus on a single individual to identify each theory with a particular individual. So we'll start with nativism, which is probably some of the most primitive models of education, and some of the more, what I would consider, straightforward models. And this is at the time of Charles Darwin, who actually had started a revolution in our understanding of heredity and genetics and evolution. And this was very much influenced by Charles Darwin in a funny way. And the prominent individual that almost like formulated nativism was Francis Galton, a British polymath who actually got involved in virtually every aspect of science. We define education as being something that's innate in humans. So the mental capacities, mental structures, they're all innate. They're all defined by Mendelian genetics. And that's the only determinant of human development. And at the time of Francis Galton, this was taken very literally. So they believe that every single trait in a particular human can be explained by a single gene. And the kind of conclusions the educationists, especially Francis Galton, drew from all this is that there are certain things that are unchangeable in the nature of human beings, and if you're born a teacher, you're born a teacher. You cannot be a teacher after you were born if you didn't have those genetic skills. And this is sometimes reflected in our everyday life or everyday educational academic world. You often see someone saying, well, don't worry about it. If she has it in it, she will learn. If she doesn't have it in it, she will not learn. And that's actually a direct reflection of this kind of nativistic theories that still permeate in our everyday life, despite the fact that a lot of has been debunked on the nativistic theories. And then, of course, we now know that single gene does not lead to a single trait, especially more complex trait, like laziness. But the nativistic theory suggested that, for instance, being a good student was a genetic trait, or laziness is a genetic trait. And the idea of this kind of feeble-mindedness was genetic. And that's where the development of intelligence quotients, the IQ tests, came out. So the IQ tests are really direct kind of reflections of the nativistic theory in being able to understand the person's potential to be whatever they could be. There are a couple of key concepts in the nativistic theory that are important to remember, not because we apply this today, but sometimes we see bits and pieces and evidence of these ideas in our societies, especially as some of the societies become more conservative and some of the societies become literally more dictatorial or autocratic. These ideas start popping up in the society. And the fundamental issue with the nativism was it was actually the fundamental educational theory that led to the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was, again, started by Francis Galton in the UK, and then Madison Grant, Henry Osborne, Charles Davenport, Henry Goddard in the United States. And these individuals are really quite interesting individuals, especially Charles Davenport, who actually ran the Cold Spring Harbor laboratories early in the 1900s, had actually traveled to England to work with Francis Galton, loved the idea of eugenics and single gene, single trait, and came to Cold Spring Harbor to catalog hundreds of thousands of families in the most superficial way to identify particular traits. And then Henry Goddard, who was actually one of the proponents of this in New Jersey, took this a little further and followed up some of the families to drive the point or to make the point that many of these traits, many of these complex traits, are actually single gene traits. And he published this, actually a very interesting book on the so-called Cullicock family. This was a very large family which was very poor and had a lot of criminals in it, a few mentally retarded individuals. There are a few what he considered feeble-minded. And then through this book and through this family, he tried to prove that this feeble-mindedness was actually a single gene trait that was passed on from one person to another. And that, of course, created this tremendously dangerous idea that you have to really sterilize individuals that are feeble-minded because you don't want them to pass on this gene of feeble-mindedness across generations. And the Cullicock family, the Henry Goddard, and especially Madison Grant, who was very rich and who put his money behind this movement, had actually convinced the United States Congress to pass laws of sterilization. That wasn't in effect until very recently in more than 30 or 40 states. And in the US alone, during this time, more than 65,000 females were sterilized with the diagnosis of feeble-mindedness. And this actually had, of course, had some serious consequences, and it still is in the books in some states, and it still influences the ideas and actions of some individuals, because nativism is still very much a part of the right-wing philosophies, especially in Eastern Europe and in the United States. And more interestingly, the Nuremberg laws drafted by the Nazi government was actually based on eugenic principles. And interestingly, a few years later, again in Nuremberg, when the Nazi scientists were put on trial for genocide, they actually pointed to the references from the United States, especially Henry Goddard and Charles Davenport, and the sterilization laws, and mentioned that we actually copied the United States by doing this. You were doing this, and you're now punishing us for doing what is being done in the United States. And today, we actually do have WISC and WAIS models, renditions of the Binet-Stanford test. This is actually probably a lot more intellectualized versions of the Binet-Stanford IQ tests. What I would like to mention is, despite their alleged success in areas which are hard to justify, no IQ test to date has been found reliably reproducible or free of bias in identifying the cognitive capacities of individuals. And interestingly, some of the terms that was developed by Henry Goddard as just technical terms to define these feeble-mindedness now have permeated in our everyday language. For instance, the term moron or imbecile were terms that Henry Goddard actually applied to cognitive capabilities of individuals based on these IQ tests. So the next theory that came after that is in terms of, I think, intellectual progress is behaviorism. Contrary to the nativists, the behaviorists looked at the learning process, the education of individuals completely different. Frederick Skinner is one of the main characters who actually has developed behavioristic theories. And according to Skinner and others, learning is a process of conditioning an individual in an environment that you stimulate, reward, and punish the learner. And contrary to the nativists, the behaviorists went entirely the other way and said inherited factors have little influence on behavior. So, according to behaviorists, you can teach anything to anyone. And if teachers provide a positive reinforcement, student learns to perform the behavior on their own. So you keep on doing something and you let the student observe what you're doing, and you reward them if they do the same thing, then that's learning for behaviorists. So behavior for them is simply a response to outside influences. And for behaviorists, the concept of free will is simply an illusion. You don't really have free will. Everything that you do is somewhat influenced by your environment, by your surroundings. There are, some key concepts that most people are familiar with behaviorism. One of them is classical conditioning, the famous Ivan Pavlov's dog. The concept of conditioned stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus. So you kind of stimulate under a particular condition and then take that condition. So you stimulate the person, you ring the bell, give the food. Ring the bell, give the food, and then after a while you ring the bell, the patient, the subject will respond in the same way, even if you don't give the food, i.e. the unconditioned stimulus. And this was the basis of learning. You just basically, in the classroom, you give the information, reward, you give the information, reward, and you expect that the person to perform it down the line. There is also the concept of operant conditioning that kind of considers the individual a little bit. And this is described as so-called associative learning through modification of behavior by reinforcement. So you're actually giving a little bit more freedom to the individual, to the learner at this stage. You're letting them do something, and if they choose to do the right thing, they get a reward. If they choose to do the wrong thing, they get a punishment. And then you're actually manipulating the environment through rewards and punishment, and expect that after that, the person will kind of find the right way. There's also this famous Pygmalion effect, a young girl who was a flower salesperson and Professor Higgins who think he could teach anyone, and Professor Higgins claims that he could take this girl and make her a socialite and take her to kind of major receptions and balls, and nobody will even realize that this person would come from a kind of a poor background. Everybody will think of this as a royalty, etc. And lo and behold, this happens. But, of course, Bernard Shaw is criticizing the society for these expectations. And then finally, the flower girl, rebels against Professor Higgins and deserts him and proves that, yes, the individual makes a difference and they can actually have innate abilities of behavior that can change their learning environment. The Pygmalion effect proposed by some, they call it also the Rosenthal effect by some behaviorists, actually is really based on weak methodology, and there really are not much data on the literature about this. The reproducibility is quite poor of these, but nevertheless, the Rosenthal effect has been highly touted and highly promoted as one way to teach. An example of a behavioristic process I think we can use in many circumstances. There's a web application called Kahoot. I think this is being used a lot in many elementary schools or middle schools. And there are even similar programs or applications that academic institutions use. And in all these examples, the teacher presents a set of questions. They give you a couple of questions. The student responses are recorded. The student answers the questions. The teacher discusses the correct answers and the wrong answers after each question. And the individuals, the students who make the correct answer, who gave the correct answer, are rewarded one way, just points and cookies, etc. And then the wrong answers are essentially punished. So by doing this, you expect that the students will prepare better for the next class. Well, usually, of course, things are much more complicated than that. And even though this is the general scheme or general schema of behaviorist approach, its efficiency or its efficacy had been questioned over the years. The next, I think, advance in our understanding of educational theories came with Jean Piaget. He was actually a psychologist, cognitive scientist, where he put cognition and the memory of the individual at the forefront. So this is actually neither at the behavioristic camp nor in the nativistic camp, and somebody's trying to bring the concept into more reality, considering both ends. And the definition of cognitism is that knowledge resides in a complex memory structure in the human mind, and that those are actually schemata or schemes. And learning is essentially construction or reshaping of these schemes, and it is actually an internal reconstructive process. Some of the principles of cognitive learning, I think, has been quite effective over the years. Number one, we'll see that trying to make the knowledge meaningful to the individual, so just basically that they could connect to the knowledge base that you're trying to teach them, apparently is very helpful, and Piaget had actually suggested that. Helping learners to relate new information to their old existing information is actually a very effective way of learning, and that's how Piaget suggests that individuals change their schemes or schemata in their brain to create new schemes. And then change of behavior in an individual is evidence for learning. And of course, learning is essentially explained in this as a recall of information. If you can recall something, that implies you have learned. At this stage, this probably has been a very revolutionary idea, but we will see that just kind of learning as just a function of recall may actually not entirely describe the process. So the key concept, again, in cognitism is the kind of schemata theory. These are concepts where you have a particular concept of, let's say, a four-legged animal. So in this figure on the left side, we are talking about that. The boy looks at a four-legged animal, and somebody says, well, this is a cat. And then boy has a schema or schema of a cat in their brain. Then, of course, every four-legged animal ends up being a cat for them. And they see a little puppy, a little dog, four-legged, same size, etc., and they call him cat. But somebody says, well, no, John, this is not a cat. This is a dog. This is a puppy. And the child learns, oh, okay, now there is something else I have to learn. Then it creates a new scheme or schema in his mind where now she has two different concepts, one for the cat and the other one for the puppy or the dog. And that's considered the so-called accommodation, right? The assimilation of new knowledge, modification of that assimilation by the outside force will actually allows this individual to create new concepts in their mind, and that's how they learn. There are a few things in the cognitivistic theory that's actually quite interesting. One of them is the more recent cognitive load theory. So we can only teach someone that much. And that actually sometimes is quite ignored, especially in the academic environments. We never sit and think where we teach 8 hours to a particular student in medical school or engineering school, and 8 hours of information with heavy loads, etc. Is that actually overloading the individuals in terms of their learning capacity? And then they have another 8 hours the next day. So I think when you look at cognitive theories, especially the cognitive load theory, there are a lot of important things that we can draw from those theories in order to modify our curriculum as well as how we teach. The cognitivist theory also are almost responsible for developing the so-called Gestalt theory. And the Gestalt theory, I think, is also a very interesting and important idea in which the sum does not reflect the entirety. So the whole is very often greater than the sum of its parts. So you have like 5 different features and you put them together and you add them together, but it still does not constitute the whole. And I think the Gestalt theory's reflection in recent years have been recognizing that online education has something that really significantly lacks vis-a-vis face-to-face education. And that's where the Gestalt comes in, where you're giving the same information online, you're passing the knowledge base, but there is more to a face-to-face or a physical interaction of education that just simply is not there when you're just simply conveying the information through online education. So one of the major opponents of online education systems has been the Gestalt theorists. And then this concept of equilibrium within the cognitive sciences is just you assimilate new information, you accommodate that new information, you create new schemes, and then you come to an equilibrium. But of course, that equilibrium is only existent until you learn new information, you come to a new situation, you find something that doesn't fit into your scheme, so you go into this kind of area of disequilibrium. So what do I do now? Then you will have to figure out the assimilation of that knowledge and accumulate. So cognitive scientists actually have found or identified significant important aspects of education. And one of the examples that came out of the cognitive school is the problem-based learning. And problem-based learning have been variably successful, especially if you take problem-based learning and understand the cognitivistic theory behind it and use it appropriately, it might be effective. However, if you think of problem-based learning as a solution for everything and do problem-based learning with every aspect, you probably will miss the cognitivistic principles that's underlying problem-based learning. It won't be effective. So according to traditional learning, there's a teacher or somebody tells you what you need to know. You take that information, you memorize it, and you regurgitate it, and then you try to solve problems with it, and that's how you'll learn. Well, the problem-based learning kind of reverses that whole thing. They give you a problem, and then by looking at the problem, you try to identify what is it that I need to know to solve this problem. And then you learn it, and then solve the problem with your new learning. Typically the problem-based learning has a few stages where you're giving a question, they define the question, they identify what they know, what they don't know, inquire, learn what they don't know through inquiry and research, then come back in groups to determine what they have learned and how they can assimilate that together. So they're creating new schemes in their mind to solve that problem. And then there's an answer that's formulated. And it's been quite effective in many circumstances. But again, using it effectively in certain environments makes problem-based learning an efficient tool. However, not understanding the principles behind it may actually backfire. The next kind of step in our understanding of educational theories is constructivism. And John Dewey, who's one of my favorite teachers, he was actually in Virginia in 1950s, early 1900s, and he has been one of the more vocal leaders of democratic education. And this is, remember, the time in 1900s and 1920s where there is increasingly more democratization of the society. With this democratization came an idea that this is not just a cognitive process, but a constructive process. For Dewey, education is not about changing behavior, but changing cognition or advancing our understanding and cognition. So it's learning, for him, was in the mind of the learner, and then learners essentially construct the knowledge in their brain rather than just ingesting it. So reading, memorizing, and regurgitating for Dewey is not essentially learning. And the other thing that are kind of interesting in the constructive theories is that most of the constructivists believe that people learn how to learn as they learn the process. As they become or mature learners, they actually understand the process of learning. And for constructivist, learning is an active process. It cannot be passive. So this actually changes the educational theories from a teacher-oriented to a student-oriented mode. And this is where that transition happens. The theories that I mentioned to you before are very much teacher-oriented theories. The teacher is at the forefront of the education. But now with the constructivist theory, at the turn of the century, people say, well, maybe teachers should not be in the center, that the students might be in the center, and this is actually a social activity. It is personal, and it exists in my mind, so I have to be motivated, and I have to be in the center of this to understand it. And this actually has become quite effective in many schools over the years. Key concept, of course, here is the democratizing education. This is when the idea that students have to participate in the learning process, students participate in the decision-making and design of the education comes from. This was not the case in earlier theories where the teacher was the authority in deciding what needs to be taught, how it needs to be taught. But here, the idea is essentially participatory education where students participate in the decision-making process. From many perspectives, cognitivism and constructivism are very similar. And sometimes you could see that some of the scientists or some of the theorists are either listed within cognitivist theories, and then at some other times they're listed under constructivist theories. These are not entirely incorrect because there are a lot of overlap between these two concepts. But the key difference I want to mention is constructivism refers to how learners learn, and the learners construct new knowledge based on their prior experience. So the constructivism does not see the person as a blank slate like the behaviorists, so it's actually adding more to it. Cognitivists do the same thing in a sense, that they're actually, they have schemes or schemas, and these schemas create new schemas. But the fundamental difference is that cognitivists thinks that this is an internal process of information where the outside has little influence. For constructivists, teachers have certain abilities or functions, or responsibilities, in other words. So teachers in constructivist environments seek and value the student's point of view. The activities challenge the assumption of the students. So basically construct new things on the existing. The teachers essentially are there to pose problems of relevance, not provide answers. And then they build lessons and they build educational activities around big ideas and assess learning in the context of teaching. So the function of the teacher has changed in the constructivist theory. So here's a kind of an example, and this is actually another theorist, Gagny, who came out with this kind of 9 events of instruction, and this has been quite useful. This is how a teacher designs a constructivist activity. First, the teacher gains attention of the individuals by maybe raising their curiosity, creating an answer, a question, posing an issue, telling a story, etc., and then provides the learning objectives. Especially the teacher notes what the learning objectives are, and these learning objectives are sometimes discussed within the activity. Then connect all of this to their prior learning. Last year you had learned, the previous year you had this, etc. Then present the new content and offer a scheme, an organizational scheme to work with the content and allow the students to work on it themselves. And as they work on it, they create products and the teachers gives feedback to it. Then at the end, assess the performance of all of this and where they are, and allow the students to do this in the real world. So this is kind of 9 events of instruction has been quite useful and very applicable in many areas of academic teaching. The next stage is, I think, kind of more modern ideas, even though the proponents of this actually were contemporaries of the earlier theories. And one of the kind of key individuals in socioculturalism is a Russian educationist called Lev Vygotsky. He's actually also a cognitive scientist. And for him, learning in essence is a sociocultural process. To define learning, you have to define the environment, you have to define the society, you have to define the individual and the interaction between those two. So culture is extremely significant in how one learns. And of course, language as a root of culture is critical. So mastering the language and understanding the language and how we communicate with the language is important in teaching for them. And individuals, in essence, in sociocultural theory, learn and develop within their role in that particular community. And as they have acquired new traits, new abilities, new knowledge, they actually function as a more effective or efficient members of their society. And the other very interesting concept, a key concept for socioculturalism, is developing the zone of proximal development. And zone of proximal development and cognitive load theory have a lot of overlapping features. And the zone of proximal development essentially implies there are three different realms, zones of learning. In those areas or realms of learning, the first, the center, is what an individual can do or learn. And this is, of course, the application of knowledge. There is another circle at the very outer skirts, is what we want the individual to do. And that's essentially the ideal state. It's kind of knowing everything in Encyclopedia Britannica, for instance. But there is a limit to what an individual can do. So most people will not get to that kind of unrealistic expectation of the ideal. So there is another circle in between these, the large and the small circle, where you can go with help. Inner circle is what I can do by yourself only. But with help, and that's the effect of education. Education provides you to develop your zone of proximal development and expand your abilities, expertise, and experience to at least try to get to the ideal, that's the outer circle. And the difference between what you can do by yourself and what you could do by help or by education is known as zone of proximal development by Witkowski. And there's some really interesting studies on this. If you were to give an example, I think the idea of collaborative learning in education, especially in high school education, is a very good example of the application of sociocultural learning. So the collaborative learning example is you receive an out-of-class assignment. So when you're at home, you get an email, you say, here's a question, we want you to answer these questions. Or here's an idea, you want you to inquire this idea. So you do that prior to class, you look for it, you try to answer it, and then when you come to class, you try to solve similar but more complex problem on the same topic, on the same learning objectives, essentially. And then by giving them different chores within the group, you're allowing some sort of collaborative, some sort of group learning and group experimentation. And then that group tries out the solutions they find, tries out the answers to the questions, etc. And then at some point they present their findings to the entire class or to a larger audience. And that presentation begets feedback and reflection from the group as well as from the outside. And then that feedback and reflections are taken back again by the group, reprocessed, kind of a revised solution is developed. And that revised solution can then be assessed through multiple parameters that include both summative and formative assessment strategies. So this has been actually quite an effective way of teaching in medical schools, especially in Canada and Europe. The next idea or theory of education is humanism. And the humanism, of course, was present in bits and pieces in all of the education theories. It's probably except for nativism. But one of the main proponents of humanism is Malcolm Knowles, who also had developed the concept of andragogy, which is adult education. So humanism essentially identifies education as a different function among pediatric children as well as adults. And the first concept is that those two groups of human beings learn differently. Knowles emphasizes that the adult education is a self-directed process, and the individuals are expected to take responsibility for their decisions and actions. And the goal of education is to create a competent individual that can function effectively in a society. And function effectively is a general, kind of a vague concept that needs to be defined well, but the goal is to provide better competencies with the individuals. And the term competency comes to play a role in humanistic theories and onward. There are a few principles of adult learning that are critical. Number one, adults need to know why they need to learn something. And it's just like, why is it helpful to me? Why am I learning this? What's going to be useful for me? And I think we see that a lot in medical education, where when the students come in and start learning year one and year two and year three, a few things about the fundamental or basic sciences, they constantly keep on asking, what is this going to do for me? And that really needs to be addressed very clearly. Adults need to learn experientially. They have to experiment. They have to be actively engaged with hands-on to be able to absorb and learn something. Adults typically approach learning as a problem-solving exercise. So the problem-based learning is actually a very good way to teach adults. Adults learn best when they told of the immediate value of their learning. So these four principles define the so-called andragogy or adult learning. And all of these have been investigated or studied extensively by Knowles and others. And it is quite clear that designing educational programs for adults has to consider features that pedagogical activities don't have to consider. And the final theory that I am going to talk about is experiential learning. And this is a learning theory that I find to be probably some of the most advanced educational theories that we have. Experiential learning is really developed from the social-cultural educational theories of Witkowski. So in the experiential learning world, you are actually really working in an environment, in a society, in a social-cultural background. The learning process for experiential learning is a transformation from an experience, that by living certain experiences, the individual actually acquires new abilities or capabilities or competencies, as the humanistics have suggested. So according to experiential learning, there are actually 4 stages of this learning cycle, which starts with active experimentation, experimenting, and developing concrete experience from these experimentations, reflecting on that observation, and then conceptualizing all of that in an abstract fashion. And these are individuals that learn in different ways. And here, the experiential learning acknowledges general categories of how learners learn. This also actually is important because now you are considering different classes or different types of learners, and in your teaching strategies, in your teaching programs, you try to do your best to accommodate all of these learning styles and include them into the learning process, so it actually is efficient for all learning styles. The 4 stages of experiential learning starts with a concrete experience. So this is actually important because many teachers suggest, well, they haven't learned anything from this. How are they going to apply this? Or they haven't learned anything about this. I haven't given them a lecture on ABC, so how do you expect them to do something on ABC? And this is one of the fundamental things the experiential learning theories change. You do not have to have formal instruction to be able to learn something. And the greatest example of this is actually reading the manuals of certain instruments. I think if you ask your students or children today, I think none of them has ever read the instruction manual of how to use an iPhone or how to use a cell phone or how to use an iPad. Yet many of the individuals can actually use iPhones or iPads without actually having received a single minute of instruction. And we always learn these through our applications. So there is actually a significant validity to starting with concrete experience. And there are many examples that I can give in my academic experience, in my academic life, that justifies all of this. There is also a significant number of studies with experiential learning that actually shows the efficacy of learning process. Now, the most important part is it's not just enough to practice something. It's not enough to do something. If you do not reflect on what you have done, and if you do not actually analyze somehow what has happened, that experience may actually be wasted. So the next thing you have to do is just go back and say, well, what happened now? Why did this happen this way? Why did it happen that way, etc. And then develop abstract concepts through this process. And these abstract concepts are sometimes guidelines, checklists, algorithms, schemes, or different things that help you conceptualize the experience and how to do this better the next time. And then, of course, after this conceptualization, you experiment on that conceptualization. You develop a scheme, you develop a checklist, and then you use that checklist on your next patient or on your next assignment. Then you find out, again, number one, with the concrete experience, what comes out of that. And that kind of constantly allows you to improve your learning or your competence through experimentation. So these are all some of the theories that are of, I think, in my opinion, or in our opinion especially, are consequential. But what is next? Because, as I mentioned in the beginning, educational theories are really theories that consider the issues, realities in the sociocultural context of today, not yesterday. And today, our learning environment is dramatically different than the theories that have been developed in the 1950s, 1900s, 1800s, etc. There are so many things that are distinctly different today. How the generations learn, how information is distributed, how to access or reach information, how to make sense of that, experimentation, etc. These are all quite different. And of course, in an era of internet, Wikipedia, Google, cell phones, iPads, e-learning, and ease of accessing information, it is kind of unrealistic to think that the educational theories of the past are going to be as efficient. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly shown to us that we need theories that actually apply to the current practice, the current realities. And one of the things that needs to be applied is when we have so much social media, when we actually exist in virtual space more than we exist in real space, how do we incorporate that into our understanding of educational theories? So the next theory is going to have to come up with a definition that fits our sociocultural, biological knowledge and experience. And by biological, I mean cognitive science as well as sociological realities. The principles that consider the environment, the learner's qualities, the role of teachers, influence of technology, and both innate as well as environmental factors are going to be important in redeveloping or reconstructing the next educational theory. As we discuss, I think learning or the education is a little bit of every theory we discussed so far. There may be kind of relevant information bits or relevant observations or methods or principles in virtually every educational theory. But maybe just like the Gestalt theorists say, the learning itself may be just actually much more than the sum of those, that there's actually a little bit more to it. And what more there is to it will need to be spelled out in the next educational theory that we could use in our everyday life. So in short, there are many well-studied educational theories, and understanding these theories really help master the teaching methods associated with them. Educational theories really inform us how the learning takes place, how students learn, and how to make use of that in our own experience. Educational theories provide a framework for understanding human behavior, human cognitive and sociocultural environment. And I think understanding this is key to improving our educational efficacy. And finally, educational theories reflect the era and the sociocultural environment they are conceived in. And understanding this allows us to understand and utilize a particular theory much better, and more importantly, develop the next theory that really influences our everyday teaching activities more than what we understand so far.